Most Americans think they know the Osage story, feathered headdresses, buffalo hunts on horseback, and, more recently, a true crime story about murder and oil money that became a major motion picture. That story is real, and it deserves to be told. But it's also only the last chapter of a much longer book, and almost nobody outside of archaeology and the tribe itself knows how that book actually begins. The truth is stranger, older, and more impressive than anything you've seen on screen. The Osage weren't originally horse-mounted plains warriors at all. Their ancestors were farmers and city builders who lived inside one of the largest, most advanced civilizations in pre-Columbian North America. And when modern science finally started digging into where they really came from, it uncovered a story involving a lost metropolis bigger than London, a genetic puzzle with two separate bloodlines, and a modern irony where DNA testing, of all things, means almost nothing to Osage identity today. This is the real story of Osage ancestry. Let's start by taking apart the image most people carry around in their heads. The Osage were famous, even to outsiders, in the 1800s for their size and presence. The painter George Catlin, who spent years documenting native nations across the continent, called them the tallest people he had ever encountered, describing men reaching 6.5 feet with some standing over 7. Washington Irving, one of the most famous American writers of his era, called them some of the finest-looking people he had seen anywhere in the West. By the early 1800s, the Osage controlled an enormous territory stretching across what's now Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and they were feared and respected by virtually every neighboring nation. This is the version of the Osage most documentaries stop at. Powerful, mounted, dominant on the plains. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions. That entire plains warrior identity, the horses, the buffalo economy, the image burned into popular imagination, only existed for about 200 years. It emerged in the late 1700s, largely as a response to American expansion pushing tribes westward. Before that, for well over 1,000 years, the ancestors of the Osage weren't living on the open plains at all. They were farmers, living in permanent towns, in the river valleys of the eastern woodlands. So if the buffalo hunting Osage isn't the beginning of the story, where does it actually start? According to Osage oral tradition, and confirmed independently by linguists and archaeologists, the story starts in the Ohio River Valley. The Osage belonged to a language family called Dejihar-Siouan, shared with 4 other nations: the Omaha, the Ponca, the Kaw, and the Quapaw. These 5 languages are so closely related that, historically, speakers could largely understand one another. And according to the oral histories of all 5 nations, they were originally one people, living together somewhere near the Ohio River, likely extending into present-day Kentucky. Sometime around 1,700 years ago, that combined group began migrating down the Ohio River toward its meeting point with the Mississippi. From there they split. One branch headed downstream and became the Quapaw, whose name literally means the downstream people. The rest headed upstream against the current, eventually settling near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, in what is now the St. Louis area. And this is where the story gets genuinely remarkable, because that location wasn't just any river junction. It was about to become the site of the largest city ever built in North America before European contact. Around 1,100 years ago, a native civilization archaeologists call the Mississippian culture reached its peak at a site now known as Cahokia. At its height, Cahokia was home to somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people, a population larger than London had at the exact same point in history. Its central structure, known today as Monk's Mound, remains the largest earthen monument ever constructed in pre-Columbian North America, rising more than 100 feet into the sky. Around it stood dozens of smaller mounds, wide public plazas, and a sprawling network of neighborhoods that made it, by any reasonable definition, America's first true city. According to Osage oral tradition, linguistic evidence, and archaeological research, the ancestral Degihar group that would become the Osage didn't just pass by this place. As the Omaha and Ponca split off and moved further north, and later the Kaw broke away and traveled up the Missouri River, one group stayed behind. The ancestors of the Osage were the last of the 5 Dejihan nations to remain in the Cahokia and St. Louis region, staying until around the year 1300, before finally shifting west into what's now Missouri. Let that sink in for a second. The Osage aren't just loosely connected to the mound-building cultures you might have heard mentioned in a textbook. Archaeologists and the Osage Nation's own Historic Preservation Office have concluded that Osage ancestors were very likely among the people who physically built and inhabited the mounds of the St. Louis area, including structures connected to the wider Cahokia complex itself. One of those mounds still exists today. It's called Sugarloaf Mound, and it's the last surviving Native American mound left standing in what colonial settlers once nicknamed Mound City, after the dozens of earthworks that used to cover the St. Louis riverfront before nearly all of them were leveled for development in the 1800s. In a genuinely striking piece of historical justice, the Osage Nation bought back a portion of that property in the 2000s, working to protect and eventually restore the very structure their own ancestors may have helped construct almost 1,000 years earlier. Now here's where actual science enters the picture, because Cahokia's population turns out to have had a secret hidden directly in their teeth. Researchers studying burials from the site used a technique called strontium isotope analysis. Strontium is a natural element that gets absorbed into tooth enamel during childhood, and its exact chemical signature varies depending on the geology of wherever a person grew up. By comparing the strontium signatures in Cahokia's burials to known local levels, scientists could tell with real precision who had grown up locally and who had come from somewhere else. The results were striking. Roughly a third of everyone tested had a non-local signature, meaning they weren't originally from the area at all. Cahokia was pulling in migrants from across the wider region, and that pattern of continuous immigration held steady right up until the city's decline in the early 1300s. Some researchers have gone so far as to call ancient Cahokia America's first melting pot. This wasn't a small, isolated farming village. It was a genuine urban centre, drawing people, ideas, and trade goods from hundreds of miles away, centuries before a single European ship reached the continent. So the ancestors of the Osage weren't just present at this city. They were residents of one of the most diverse, most dynamic population centres in the entire pre-Columbian Americas. Now let's talk about what's actually written into their DNA, because there's a genuinely obscure genetic story here that almost never makes it into popular retellings of Native American history. Nearly every indigenous population across North and South America carries a Y chromosome lineage called Q-M3. The dominant founding paternal marker tracing back to the small population that crossed from Siberia during the last ice age. That part isn't unique to the Osage, it's shared broadly across the hemisphere. But there's a second, much rarer paternal lineage that shows up disproportionately in one particular group of native nations, Siouan and Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Great Plains. It's called haplogroup C-P39. Genetic studies testing Plains Siouan communities like the Sioux have found this lineage present in a meaningful minority of men tested, alongside similar findings among Algonquian-speaking groups like the Cheyenne. Geneticists still debate exactly how and when this lineage entered the population. Some researchers argue it represents an entirely separate, possibly later migration wave into the Americas, distinct from the main founding population that carried the dominant Q lineage. What that means is this: the broader Siouan-speaking family that the Osage belong to may carry genetic fingerprints from more than one ancient migration event, a layered ancestry that's more complex than the simple single-wave story most people were taught in school. It's a detail modern genetics is still actively working out, and it rarely makes it past academic journals into anything the public actually sees. There's something almost poetic about that layered genetic history, because Osage cosmology has been describing something similar for centuries, long before anyone had ever heard the word DNA. Traditional Osage society was structured around a dual origin story. One half of the nation, the Sisho, were known as the Sky People, said to have descended from the heavens to take physical form on Earth. The other half, the Hunka, were called the Earth People, an existing community the Sky People encountered when they arrived. According to the tradition, the two groups negotiated, decided to live together, and merged into a single nation, while deliberately preserving the memory of their separate origins in their clan system, their village layout, and their ceremonies. Together, they called themselves Niu Konska, the children of the Middle Waters, a name honoring the river confluences that shaped their migration. It's a creation story about two distinct peoples merging into one. And whether or not you read it as literal history, it's a striking cultural echo of exactly the kind of population blending that archaeologists and geneticists now believe actually happened across the Mississippian world the Osage's ancestors lived in. So if the deep ancestry of the Osage is this well documented, this rich, why does the word DNA still cause so much tension inside the tribe today? This is where the story takes its most unexpected turn, because it has almost nothing to do with ancient migration and everything to do with the present. Unlike a lot of what people assume about Native American identity in the 21st century, the Osage Nation does not accept commercial DNA testing, not from Ancestry, not from any other consumer service, as valid proof of Osage ancestry. None of it counts. Osage citizenship is governed entirely by a legal roll that was permanently closed by the federal government in 1906, at exactly 2,229 names. To be an Osage citizen today, you have to prove documented lineal descent from someone on that specific list. A genetic test, no matter what percentage of indigenous ancestry it claims to detect, carries no legal weight at all. This isn't just bureaucratic red tape. The Osage Nation's tribal court has held formal hearings involving dozens of individuals whose claimed ancestry was disputed because, unlike most tribes, Osage citizenship comes with something extraordinarily valuable attached to it. In the early 1900s, massive oil deposits were discovered beneath Osage land, and for a brief period, the Osage became, per capita, some of the wealthiest people on the planet. That wealth is distributed through something called head rights, shares in the tribe's mineral estate that get passed down through documented family lines, not through blood quantum tests or genetic markers. That wealth is also what triggered one of the darkest chapters in American history, a chapter most people only know through a recent film, but whose real details go deeper than any 2.5-hour movie could cover. Because Osage headright holders couldn't simply spend their own oil wealth freely, the federal government assigned many of them court-appointed white guardians, supposedly to manage their finances. In practice, this system opened the door to systematic theft, exploitation, and, in a wave of crimes now known as the Reign of Terror, outright murder. Historians still can't agree on exactly how many Osage people were killed for their headrights during this period. Official investigations counted around 24 deaths. Many historians and Osage families themselves believe the real number was far higher, quite possibly exceeding 100, with numerous suspicious deaths at the time never properly investigated at all. Only one person was ever convicted as the mastermind behind the murders. After that wave of killings, Congress restricted headright inheritance specifically to documented descendants, and tribal control over the mineral rights was eventually made permanent. Today, real money still flows through those headrights, which is exactly why the Osage Nation treats paper genealogy as the only legitimate proof of identity, and treats a spit-in-a-tube DNA kit as essentially meaningless. It's a striking contradiction once you think about it. The deep ancestral story of the Osage is one of the best documented indigenous origin stories in North America, built on archaeology, linguistics, oral tradition, and genetics, all pointing in the same direction. But modern Osage identity itself runs entirely on paper, precisely because too much is at stake to leave it to a genetic test that can be gamed, misread, or simply doesn't capture what tribal citizenship actually means. There's one more piece of this story worth knowing, because it puts everything else in painful perspective. The Osage language, the living descendant of that original Degihar-Siouan tongue spoken in the Ohio Valley more than 1,000 years ago, very nearly disappeared completely. The last person who grew up speaking Osage as a true first language died in 2005. For a while after that, the tribe had no fully fluent speakers left at all, only a small number of elders and second language learners who could speak or pray in it during ceremonies. Federal boarding schools spent decades actively punishing native children for speaking their own languages. And Osage was one of thousands of indigenous languages pushed to the edge of extinction as a direct result. In the years since, the Osage Nation has fought hard to bring it back, building a standardized written alphabet, launching immersion schools, and training a new generation of second language speakers from scratch. It's slow, difficult work, rebuilding a language essentially from the ground up. But it means that same tongue, the one spoken by farmers on the banks of the Ohio River 17 centuries ago, the one spoken by the people who likely built Cahokia, is still being spoken today by children in a classroom in Oklahoma because their community refused to let it die. So let's bring this all together, because the real story here is bigger and frankly more impressive than the version most people have in their heads. The Osage were never just plains warriors on horseback. That identity was a relatively brief, late chapter layered on top of well over 1,000 years of history as farmers, river people and city dwellers, living inside a Siouan-speaking family of nations that once called the Ohio River Valley home. Their direct ancestors were very likely residents of Cahokia, a genuine pre-contact American metropolis larger than London at its peak, a city built by tens of thousands of people, a third of whom, according to the science hidden in their own teeth, weren't originally from there at all. Their broader Siouan family may carry the genetic trace of more than one ancient migration into the Americas, a layered ancestry modern genetics is still working out. And their own oral tradition has been quietly encoding a story of two separate peoples, merging into one for longer than written history has existed in North America. The Osage weren't simply horse-mounted hunters who appeared on the plains out of nowhere. They were the last keepers of a great river civilization, carrying its bloodlines, its cosmology, and its memory west with them when that civilization finally came to an end. And maybe that's the real answer to the question in the title. The ancient origins DNA and archaeology keep revealing aren't a twist that undermines the Osage story. They're proof that the real story was always far bigger, older and more remarkable than the one most of us were originally told, and that it's still being written today, one restored word